بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم لك الحمد وإليك المشتكى وأنت المستعان وعليك البلاغ ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Inshallah, hopefully this evening we're going to be beginning a series of lessons and lectures specifically dealing with a really important subject Islamically that's not studied much nowadays, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And in order for anybody to come to an understanding of al-ahkam or rulings, especially when it comes to Islamic fiqh issues, it's incumbent then upon this person to also study the science separately. Because fiqh, when you're studying an actual fiqh text or the science of fiqh itself, it doesn't clearly give you why or how this issue was reached and how this mas'ala came to be. But once you study the philosophy that comes behind the fiqh, then you begin to understand, okay, this is the reason why this issue has this specific ruling. Then you will understand the means and ways in which evidence is utilized in order to come to a conclusion. And you come to realize that what constitutes evidence in and of itself? What does evidence even mean? What is valid to be used as evidence and what isn't valid to be used as evidence? And when there's something which has been considered valid to be used as evidence, is that something which is agreed upon, or is it something which there is or is it something in which there is a difference of opinion amongst many of the scholars? You have something which is the foundation, and then you have something which is built upon that foundation. And you'll come to see, inshallah, that this actually is a science that existed all the way until the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Only after subsequent generations came to pass was there those who came later who worked and they did extra amounts of effort, and they added on to the knowledge that was before them, and they built on what their teachers and their teachers and their teachers already laid down. And you'll come to see, inshallah, as we'll mention, inshallah, how this is a science that's developed over 1,000 years. And you see that there are many scholars who came throughout the generations who also contributed to this knowledge and to this science as well. And there isn't any time period in history, including the time that we're living in, except that this type of knowledge is always something which is very important for somebody to learn, especially when considering the fact that we as a Muslim community, we live here in the West, in a place where Muslims are a minority. And this is something which rarely has ever happened in Islamic history. From the onset of the time in which the Prophet ﷺ, he left and he established himself in Medina, rarely would you find a situation in which people of Islamic faith or people who were Muslims, who were living in a country in which they were a minority. Okay? And then learning this type of knowledge is very, very important. And inshallah, we're going to study first and foremost the history. So today is going to be mainly a story about Islamic history in relation to this science. And inshallah, then we're going to give a brief biography to the author of the original work, which is al-waraqat, Imam Abu Ma'ali al-Juwayni. And then we will give a brief introduction into the biography of the one who's the commentator on that book, whose name is Jalaluddin al-Mahali. And then inshallah we'll go into the text, bi'idhnillah, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills. What did usul al-fiqh look like in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? In the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was there ever a situation in which he alayhi salatu wasalam gave a reason as to why he did what he did? There's a hadith that's collected fi sahih, that's an authentic hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned something. One day the companions, he was with them alayhi salatu wasalam, and he said to them, لا يصلين أحدكم العصر إلا في بني قريظة. None of you pray the salat, none of you pray salat al-asr unless you reach reached the locality of Bani Qurayza. Anybody who studied the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, you probably know that Bani Qurayza was a Jewish tribe that lived in Medina. Okay? And the Prophet ﷺ was given a commandment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself to go forth and to go and or evict that specific community out of Medina completely. And then he ﷺ, he gave these instructions to these companions. Now, this is like a hadith for us. For people who weren't with the Prophet ﷺ, it would be considered an authentic narration. So they were receiving instruction from the Prophet ﷺ. Sorry, excuse me. And then he ﷺ gave them this commandment, and what they had to do is go and fulfill it. But then what happened was there was a dispute when the Prophet ﷺ left, and you had this group going, you had a dispute amongst the Prophet amongst the companions as to what exactly he ﷺ meant when he said, don't pray the Asr prayer until you reach the locality of Bani Qurayza. Does that mean that we don't pray Asr at all, even if the Maghrib prayer is about to come in? And we just pray Asr no matter what happens? Should we take the literal meaning and only pray Asr when we reach the locality of Bani Qurayza? Or should we understand the Prophet ﷺ's words to mean something more metaphorical, which means, be very quick and hasten, okay, to the point in which, don't even pray Salatul Asr at all until you reach that locality. Meaning quick and be in a hurry. So then they disputed as to exactly what the Prophet ﷺ meant. A group of the companions, they took the literal meaning, and another group, they took a more figurative meaning as to what the Prophet ﷺ meant. And then some of the group, they prayed, because what happened was they missed the Asr prayer. They wouldn't have made it for Asr in the locality of Bani Qurayza. So then some of them, they prayed the Asr there, some of them took the literal meaning and said, no, we're not going to pray unless and until we reach the locality of where the Prophet ﷺ told us to pray. And then you had a split amongst the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And then what happened after that was when the Prophet ﷺ was informed about what took place, sawwabahuma. The Prophet ﷺ approved of the understanding of both groups. So what the fuqaha, they mention, and especially the usuliyin, what they say is, the Prophet ﷺ was encouraging and he was pleased with the fact that he didn't have to spell it out for anybody, and that he allowed the companions to come to their own conclusions as to how best to understand what he meant. It was something that the Prophet ﷺ wanted them to do, because he knew ﷺ that he's not going to be alive forever. So he knew that there will have to come a time in which people, especially the scholarly class amongst the companions and in the generations that come after, there will have to come a time in which they will be able to be equipped and have the ability to be able to extract rulings directly from a verse in Quran, a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, or any types of legislation, that which we're going to mention inshallah. There was an incident where the Prophet ﷺ, he sent one of the great companions, one of the greatest of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, from the scholarly class of the companions as well. His name was Mu'adh ibn Jabal anhu, and he sent him to Yemen. And you have to realize that the Prophet ﷺ, when he passed away, he left behind, perhaps, depending on the variation, depending on the narration, maybe around 13,000, 14,000, 15,000 companions when he passed away, alayhi salatu wasalam. But the question arises, how many of these companions were able or willing to give fatwa? If you read an Imam al-Nasa'i in his book, his Sunan al-Kubra, he mentions something very interesting. He says, when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, only between 18 and 22 were readily available to give fatwa on behalf of any Islamic ruling at that time. Ibn Hazm in his book al-Mahali, he mentions the number to be around in the 20s, showing you that despite their great number, that those who would actually give fatwa amongst the companions were very small. And some of them would have included Mu'adh ibn Jabal, the person who rated the hadith I'm going to quote to you inshallah, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Abbas, and some others as well. So these were the people, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, Aisha radiallahu anha, Salama, and a few others were the ones who were able to give fatwa. And notice how it was very inclusive of both men and women as well. So that's something which is very interesting. في عهد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, during the time in which the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم he lived, he sent Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu to the people of Yemen. And when he sent him there, before he sent him there, he asked and he briefed Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu ardahu, and he said to him, بِمَ تَقْضِي إِذَا عُرِضَ لَكَ قَضَاء. If you are asked a question, how will you judge and how will you answer the question that you are asked? And then he replied and he said, أَقْضِي بِكِتَابِ اللَّهِ. I will use the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran. My answer will formulate based on what the Quran says. And then the Prophet ﷺ said to him, فَإِن لَمْ تَجِدْ. What if you don't find the answer in the Quran? Showing you that there might be a possibility, and he ﷺ was giving them the information that there might be a situation where you won't find an answer in the Quran. So he said, فَإِن لَمْ تَجِدْ. If you don't find that, then what are you going to do? Then he replied, قَالَ أَقْضِي بِسُنَّةِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. I will use and I will refer back to the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, فَإِن لَمْ تَجِدْ. What if you don't find anything from my prophetic tradition? What if I never spoke about this issue myself? And this hadith is an authentic hadith. He said sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu, he replied and he said, أَجْتَهِدُ رَأْيِي. I will formulate my own opinion based on my ijtihad. This is a great companion. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, Alhamdulillahi alladhi waffaqa rasula rasulillahi lima yurdi Allah wa rasulahu. He said, Alhamdulillah, praise be due to Allah who gave tawfiq. The word tawfiq in the Arabic language means guidance to that which is truthful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides you to that which is most pleasing to Him and that which is correct. This is where the word tawfiq comes from. So he said, Alhamdulillah, praise be due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who gave tawfiq to the messenger of Allah in that which pleases Allah and His messenger. Meaning praise be due to Allah who enabled you to come with the correct answer and to have the correct understanding. And this hadith was collected by Imam Abi Dawud in his Sunan. And it's an authentic hadith. The vast majority of the muhaddithin classify this hadith as minimum as being sound. There are a few of the scholars, very few in number, who mention that this hadith has some weakness, but the reality is that it's quite strong. And it's something which is used as istidlal for many of the usuliyin and the fuqaha that speak about this topic. So you already come to understand that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it was something that he encouraged his companions, especially those amongst the scholarly class, especially those who are learned. He encouraged them that when they do not find a verse in the Quran speaking about a topic, or they do not find a hadith from the prophetic traditions, then to try and come to an understanding based on what we have of revelation, which means the Quran and the Sunnah and other means of other means, as you will come to see inshallah, of how to derive rulings, inshallah, that's acceptable Islamically. And then this came and this continued all the way up until the time in which the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they lived. And this was something when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, and the Muslims they spread and the communities increased and they went to new lands and they migrated, then this urgency only became more prevalent. The fact that you had to answer, now we have communities who are embracing Islam. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. And you will see people coming into the religion in droves. But you have to understand that the people who are coming into Islam, these are people who have questions. Many of them come and many of them had previous civilizations that they lived. Many of them had different religions. So many of them are going to have certain types of questions that are very different to the type of questions that the Muslims who lived in Hijaz would have had. So you have to understand that the tradition, especially of Imam Malik, when he was based in Medina, especially the people of the Hijaz, they weren't receiving the types of questions that Imam Abu Hanifa, who was living in Kufa, was receiving. And that's the nature of geography, because the place where they lived were very different. The communities that they lived amongst were very different. The cultures that they engaged with were very different. So what is going to be the ultimate consequence would be that the questions that they receive will be very different. You will have much more questions, much more philosophical questions in Iraq than you have in Medina, as an example. But would that have been a situation, or would that have been a problem to the point in which many of the companions like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who moved to Kufa, would have said, I don't feel comfortable answering these questions because these were not the types of questions that I used to hear when I was in Medina. That wasn't his attitude. And in fact, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of the earliest companions who would give a fatwa, and he would give his own answer without referring back to the Quran or the Sunnah. He was the first person from the companions to do that. When he couldn't find an ayah in Quran, there was a question came to him about inheritance. And he said, I don't know any answer relating to this question from the Quran, this specific question. Nor do I know any ahadith from the prophetic traditions that speak about this specific issue. However, ajtahid, I'll do my ijtihad tells me that the answer, أن يكون الجواب كذا وكذا. I believe the answer is this and that. This was something that he was he had that tradition. He was somebody who would do that. As opposed to, say, for example, Abdullah ibn Umar, which shows you the differences in the way that they would tackle questions, even among in an early stage amongst the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. So during the time in which the companions of the Prophet ﷺ came, there were at least 5 main principles that the companions they used whenever a question would come to them. Okay, and you'll understand, you'll come to understand, inshallah, that the usul al-fiqh as a science is is dealing, okay, with what constitutes as evidence. Okay, what is considered to be evidence, what isn't considered to be evidence. And I'll mention, inshallah, some other things later on, inshallah, that it also constitutes, depending on the different traditions in usul al-fiqh itself. Just like you have different madhabs in fiqh, there's also, many people don't know, but there's also different madhabs in usul al-fiqh as well. So in usul al-fiqh there are different means, and there's different ways of coming, there's different schools, and there's different traditions in how to tackle adillah. And what does it mean when we say the Prophet ﷺ said this? And what does that constitute, and what does that mean? And we'll come to that, inshallah. The first principle they followed is تقديم القرآن والسنة على ما سواهما وعلى ما سواهما. Anything, they would give taqdeem of al-Quran wa sunnah ala ma siwahuma. Anything else, the precedence lied with the Quran and the Sunnah. So the first thing that they would always look into would be the Quran, and that's understandably so, because that's the first major legislation in the Quran is the Quran. The first major legislation when it comes to anything is the Quran. And that which comes after the Quran is the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And Imam Jalaluddin al-Mahali, he's going to speak about that topic a lot, inshallah. What is the nature of the Quran in terms of how we derive a ruling and how we derive evidence from it. And also what is the nature of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in how we derive evidence from it as well. So the first one is that you give taqdeem to the Quran and to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The second one would be ظهور الإجماع. Al-ijma' means a consensus, and inshallah we'll come to speak about all of these more, inshallah. But this is something that the companions actually did. So you'll find a situation, you'll find a circumstance in which one of the companions was asked a question and he would refer and he said, قال الله تعالى. And you'll find a situation or a scenario in which a companion will ask the question and he would say, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم said this and that. So you already understood that the companions used this as evidence. They understood that these are primary sources in our religion. And then you also had a situation in which they also referred back to the consensus of the community, meaning the consensus of the people who were Muslims. And it was a situation that was very well known, that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu جمع رؤساء الناس أو رؤساء الناس. What he did was, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he gathered the main heads, okay, of the companions. And he made وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he would do shura with them. فَإِذَا أَجْمَعُوا عَلَى شَيْءٍ قَضَى بِهِ. Whenever they all united upon something, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu would take that automatically. So this was a situation in which it showed. And how do you assume some of the ways in which Khilafah exists, or the nature of Khilafah itself, is done through ijma', and that's another topic inshallah. But the point is that ijma' is considered to be an authentic or legitimate legislation in Sharia. How does that work? What does that even mean? Inshallah, we'll come to that. There's an entire chapter in the book that speaks about that. When we reach it, we'll speak about it. Also, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, he used to do the same. So when Umar ibn al-Khattab was a Khalifa, he would also follow the tradition of Abu Bakr, in which whenever there was a qadiyya or any issue, he would gather all of the companions and he would speak to them. And when they judged on a matter, this is especially when there is no ayah in Quran that speaks about the issue, or there is no hadith, he would gather the companions. If they all agree on something, he would take that. Before he even agrees on anything, he would say, did Abu Bakr speak about this issue? If they tell him no, then only after that point will he take their consensus into consideration. Also, the third principle, inshallah, is that they would give precedence over a verse in Quran or a prophetic tradition which came later over that which was earlier, if there was a seeming contradiction. So if there was a conflict between two different narrations, then what they would do is that they would research and they would take that which was later, that which was mutaakhir, that which came later, over that which was mutaqaddim, which came earlier. And this is an example that happened in the time of the companions in which this actually took place. And this is something which is very important, especially for us to understand. One of the rijal of al-Bukhari, one of his men, meaning one of the people who used to take narration from the great scholar of Islam, Wahab ibn Munabbih, alayhi rahmatullah, he once mentioned something very important. He said, I learned so much hadith, hatta tahayyartu, until I became extremely confused. And this shows you the nature that the way that knowledge is supposed to be studied isn't that you just take a book of hadith and you open it and you just say Quran and Sunnah and then you go along with that. There are principles and there are methods in which people have to understand. There's a criteria. It doesn't work that way. And he said, I learned so much hadith that I became crazy, I became confused. And he said, Lawla Malik, if had it not been for Imam Malik, wa Layth ibn Sa'ad, and Layth, the great faqih of Egypt, he said, had it not been for those two, I would have been destroyed. Because when they came to me, they said to me, take this hadith, ignore this one, take this one, forget this one, take this one. And they sifted all of the hadith out, which ones were acceptable, which ones were accepted in ahkam, and which wasn't. You might find a scenario in which you might find an absolutely authentic hadith, but it's not ma'murun bihi, meaning it's not supposed to be acted upon. What are you going to do then? How would you know that when you don't study usul al-fiqh? Or how would you know that when somebody doesn't understand or doesn't study fiqh itself? Just because the hadith is authentic doesn't necessarily mean that you act upon it. There are certain principles. How do you know if it's mansukh or not? How do you know if it hasn't been abrogated or not? How do you know if it's still applicable to a certain situation? These are things that the fuqaha and the usuliyin, they spent their entire lives trying to decipher. And inshallah, I'll give you an example here from Ibn Mas'ud himself, alayhi rahmatullah. Ibn Mas'ud, he once mentioned something interesting, and he did istidlal. He mentioned the ayah in Quran, and he said, وَأُولَاتُ الْأَحْمَالِ أَجْلُهُنَّ أَن يَضَعْنَ حَمْلَهُنَّ. He mentioned that the term or the iddah period for a woman who's pregnant is after childbirth. So when childbirth takes place, the iddah period of the woman comes to an end. That's the ayah in Surah Al-Talaq. And then he used that as evidence to say that the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah is not applicable anymore. The ayah when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَالَّذِينَ يُتْوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ أَرْبَعَةَ أَشْهُرٍ وَعَشْرًا. He mentioned that the verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and those women who are widowed, Okay, those women who are widowed, they leave behind. So those men who passed away and they left behind their wives, they will have their iddah period for 4 months and 10 days. That specific verse, Ibn Mas'ud said this applied to both the pregnant woman and the woman who wasn't pregnant. But this was cancelled out by the verse in Surah At-Talaq. So he understood the principle of al-nasikh wal-mansukh. Even though it wasn't codified at that time, and even though it wasn't something which was written, the concept existed. So usul al-fiqh as a concept in which you give taqdeem and preference for one verse over another verse, or you're able to hash out which one is applicable and which one isn't applicable, that existed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. It existed in the time of the companions. Only at a later stage was it documented, written down, codified, added upon, and improved. People have to understand that that's how these sciences work. They didn't come from nowhere. Fiqh existed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. All of these sciences that we study today existed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ, he would give a commentary, a sharh and an explanation on certain words which were difficult for somebody to understand. That was a lesson not only in fiqh, but that was also a lesson in Arabic as well. So these are things which existed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, the Prophet ﷺ, he encouraged his ummah to continue and to work upon it and to continue investing their time and their effort, especially the scholars, into contributing whatever they could to these sciences. So then what happened? So this was the time of the companions in which you understand already Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he had the understanding of making that distinction between that which was that which was abrogating and that which was abrogated. You also had a situation in which the fourth principle that they acted upon was qiyas. So the companions also used to perform qiyas during the time of during their generation. So for example, I'll give you an example of an incident that took place with Umar ibn al-Khattab and Ali ibn Abi Talib. This was narrated and it was mentioned that Ali radiallahu anhu أنه قال لعمر. Ali ibn Abi Talib, one day he mentioned and he said to Umar ibn al-Khattab, he said, إِنَّ الرَّجُلَ إِذَا شَرِبَ. When a person drinks alcohol, sakira, they become drunk or they become intoxicated. When Ibn al-Khattab, he was asking the companions, what should be the legitimate punishment for somebody who drinks alcohol? According to the madhab, according to us, the Shafi'i, we mention and we say the legitimate one is 40 lashes. That's what is said in the madhab. But according to this, you will come to understand that there's a reason as to why they have these differences of opinion. Ali ibn Abi Talib, he mentioned and he says, إِنَّ الرَّجُلَ إِذَا شَرِبَ سَكِرْ. When somebody drinks alcohol, they become intoxicated. وَإِذَا سَكِرَ هَذَا. And when they become intoxicated, they become delirious and they start saying things. وَإِذَا هَذَا إِفْتَرَى. And when they become delirious and they start saying things, they start making up things and they start making up things and they start slandering people. فَحَدُّهُ حَدَّ الْمُفْتَرِي ثَمَانُونَ جِلْدًا. He said, so the punishment of somebody who gets drunk shouldn't be 40, but it should be 80. Similar to the person who makes accusations and slanders people. Look at the level of understanding that Ali ibn Abi Talib used. He said, because they will ultimately do the same thing, then they should get the same punishment. This is what is known as al-qiyas, because there's no direct revelation. There's no direct ayah in Quran that mentions this. Nor is there a hadith which mentions this. But he used dalilul aqli. He uses intellect. And he said, this is what they'll ultimately do. Just because the alcohol was the cause and the catalyst, doesn't necessarily mean that nullifies the outcome. The outcome is still there. You will end up slandering, you will end up doing this, and you will end up doing that. Therefore, the punishment applies here in this situation. Imagine. So this is a situation in which Ali ibn Abi Talib, one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, used qiyas during the time in which he was living. So you can already begin to understand that these are principles that were used and existed in the time of the companions, and also in the time of the Prophet ﷺ also. The principle number 5 that they used was al-maslaha. What's in the greater interest? What's in the greater interest of the people? What is in the greater interest of these people, or this person, or this specific individual who's asking me the question? If I were to give them an answer, would that be detrimental to this person? Would there be a risk in which this person might be in a situation in which it make their situation much worse? These are things that people used to look into. How often is it nowadays that people even look into the background of those people who come to them and asking them a question? In those days, people would not look into the background of the person who's asking a question. They would look into their situation. They will try and understand, and they will try to come to terms with where is this person coming from, so I can give them an appropriate answer. Because a fatwa was never only about halal or haram or do this and do that. That's not how, it wasn't black and white. You would probably have a situation, and this was very common, in which two different people would come with the exact same problem, and they would receive two completely different answers. And this was fully dependent on their condition and their circumstances. And ultimately, this is what it means to do al-maslaha. This is something which they did even in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. I'll give you another example from Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, because he was one of the people. When you think about Ali ibn Abi Talib, most of us, we don't think about someone who's from the scholarly class of the companions. Most of the stories that you read about Ali radiallahu anhu is the stories of heroism. The fact that he was a hero of the Muslims, especially many of the battles of the Prophet ﷺ. But he was from the scholarly class as well, from the scholarly class of the companions, radiallahu anhu jameen. There was a situation in which Ali ibn Abi Talib somebody came to him and asked him about tadmin as-suna, compensation. Is compensation something that should be given for somebody, okay, who is liable for any damages? I gave you something to borrow, and you took that what I gave you, and you exposed it to harmful elements, as an example, or you exposed it to being harmed, and it got destroyed, as an example. Are you liable? Can I go to the court and say I want compensation? This person, I gave them something to borrow, and they exposed it in a way in which it put it up, and they put it in harm's way, and ultimately it was destroyed. Ali ibn Abi Talib, a question was raised to him, and they said to him, speaking about what should be done in terms of compensating somebody, okay, who was wronged, especially when it comes to something of value. And then he said, لا يصلح الناس إلا ذاك. He said, it's not appropriate for the people to act except by promoting the concept of compensation for damages, so people are liable. This was not something that he took from the Quran. This wasn't something that he took from the Prophet ﷺ. This was something that he understood. And this was lil-maslaha, for the maslaha of the people. And then he used that وَقَضَى بِهِ, and he implemented it. And this all happened during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the time of the companions, when they were the ones who were giving their fatwa, and they were the ones who were giving answers to the questions that people were bringing to them. And the reason why he gave that answer was simply because of the fact that otherwise there would be, it was understandable that had there not been this concept, if this didn't exist in the society that he was living in, it would have caused huge problems. It would have meant what? It would have meant that anybody could harm somebody, anybody could harm someone's property, and nobody would ever be liable for anything. But the fact that he mentioned this shows you that the companions were people who used to think. They were not people who would wait around. If they didn't find a hadith or they didn't find an ayah in Quran, they would use ijtihad. And this was perfectly fine. And this was something that the Prophet ﷺ encouraged them to do. This was something which was encouraged. This was something which was expected. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He doesn't want an ummah which is brain dead. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the people who are contributing. There would be no value in Islamic scholarship if everything was already if everybody is spoon-fed already and everybody knew the answer to everything. What value would there be in Islamic scholarship? What value would there be in going out to learn what needs to be learned in order for a person to come to an understanding and ultimately contribute? Because that's what you're going to do. If you learn something, the whole point is that you contribute. What would the point be if everybody already knew the answer? The whole point is that there's a huge portion that was left for the people to do, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can justify giving them a reward, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can uplift them, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can reward them, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could make it a virtuous act. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't intend for every single person to have the answer. Go and seek it yourself. You have the foundations, you have the Quran, you have the prophetic traditions. Now the scholarship is up to you. And everybody is rewarded. The one who's wrong, the one who's right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward everyone. As is going to be mentioned inshallah in this book, as you will come to see inshallah. Then also, after the era or the generation of the companions, you had the generation of those who succeeded the companions. And when their time came along, it only became more emphasized. That's when the whole traditions began to evolve into something which was almost an independent science in of itself. Not fully, that came in the generation after, but that's when this early signs of that development was taking place. So you had a situation in which 4 main things were looked into. Any ruling was looked into, ahkamullah ta'ala fi kitabihi, that which was mentioned in the Quran. You had ahkamu Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam min sunnatihi or fi sunnatihi. You had the ahkam that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So these were things that they already had. Then they had ahkamu sahaba, the rulings of the sahaba, and the questions and the answers that they gave. So they already had that also. And the generation of those who came after were the likes of Sa'id ibn Musayyib, Urwat ibn Zubayr, Al-Qasim ibn Muhammad, Abu Bakr ibn Abdul Rahman, Ubaydillah ibn Utbah ibn Mas'ud, and you had many others also. So these were from the generation of those who succeeded the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And all of them were students of the companions. So you had a situation in which these students developed, they contributed and they developed, they increased in developing these sciences that existed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And they contributed a lot. But when everything truly went when things went on turbo speed was the generation that came after. Because that's when they started writing it down. So when you had the generation of the Immat al-Mujtahideen, we're talking about the likes of Abu Hanifa, we're talking about the likes of Imam Malik, you had the likes of Imam al-Shafi'i, and you had the likes of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and you had the likes of al-Awza'i, and you had the likes of al-Layth ibn Sa'ad, and you had the likes of Abu Thawr, and you had the likes of Sufyan al-Thawri, and you had all of these different. This is when usul al-fiqh became something which was extremely important, and it became something which was, that's when it was first documented, it was first written down. It's mentioned that Imam Abu Hanifa alayhi rahmatullah, he was one of the people in his madhab. He used as a principle, first and foremost, the Quran. So I'm going to be mentioning, inshallah, from this point on, I'm going to be mentioning some of the traditions, inshallah. I'm going to be mentioning the different traditions within usul al-fiqh, inshallah, and how that developed. So Imam Abu Hanifa, alayhi rahmatullah, let's begin with him. Because he was from the tradition of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he migrated to Kufa, and the student of Imam Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was who? The famous student of the great companion Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu was none other than a person called Alqama, and also Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. And they also had their students. So this is the line of Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa, the student of al-Nakha'i was who? Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, who was the teacher of Abu Hanifa. So he took this tradition from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. That's the line of Abu Hanifa. For those people who think that Abu Hanifa is weak in hadith and he's this and that, and people who have a huge misunderstanding and misconception of what the Hanafi madhab is. He was one of the people who his fatwa was directly linked to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, directly linked to Ali ibn Abi Talib. One day the Khalifa even called him and said to him, tell us your men. He said, my fatwa, everything that you see is either directly or indirectly from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and others as well. So he, in the time of the development of the Hanafi usul, Imam Abu Hanifa himself, his preference was the Quran, first and foremost. And then the Sunnah, the Sunnah too, and the Sunnah that comes after. Then the fatwa of the companions, the questions that came to the companions and the answers to those questions. فَإِذَا فَتَاوَى صَحَابَ يَأْخُذُ مَا يَجْمَعُونَ عَلَيْهِ. He would only take from the companions' fatwa that which they agreed upon. So if there was an ijma' amongst the companions, if there was a consensus, he would take that. If there was a difference of opinion amongst the companions, he would choose and he would do ijtihad as to which one he thought was the most correct. Because once there's a difference of opinion even amongst the companions, what does that indicate? That indicates that the mas'ala isn't one which is mujma' alayh. There is no consensus on that issue, which allowed there to be a leeway for the companions to try and contribute as to what they thought was the best course of approach. And then they would contribute themselves, and this led eventually to there being a difference of opinion even amongst the companions. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He wanted. This is muradullah, is Allah's murad. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended. And all of them are rewarded. And all of them are ma'jur. And then any of those issues that they had a difference of opinion on, Imam Abu Hanifa, his approach was, he would look at those issues and he would look into those and then he would do his ijtihad. But he wouldn't do his ijtihad alone. The greatest scholars of Kufa would all gather. So you'd have Imam Abu Hanifa, and then you would have Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, and then you have Qadi Abu Yusuf, and you have others who are in one majlis, and then Imam Abu Hanifa would come and sit down and he would say, this is an issue, اختلف فيه صحابة رسول الله. The companions, they themselves had a difference of opinion on this issue. Our great teacher, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, said this, but we have something else that Abdullah ibn Umar said. And then he would say this to them, and then he would say, what do you think the answer is? This is the method of Abu Hanifa alayhi rahmatullah. So then Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani would give his ijtihad. These were mujtahideen. And then you would have Qadi Abu Yusuf who would also give an answer. Sometimes Abu Hanifa would say, Qadi Abu Yusuf is correct. This is what it seems to me as if Qadi Abu Yusuf is the one who's the most correct. Sometimes he would say, I believe Muhammad ibn Hassan is the one who's most correct. And sometimes he would say, I think both of you are wrong. And I think the correct opinion is what I say, and then he would give his own answer. That was the method of Abu Hanifa alayhi rahmatullah. لا ولا يأخذ برأي التابعين لأنهم رجال مثله. Imam Abu Hanifa wouldn't take the opinions of the tabi'een. And when he was asked, he would say, إنهم رجال ونحن رجال. They are men, we are men. He said, they are men, we are also men. Meaning, if our obligation is towards Allah, towards the Prophet ﷺ, towards the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, any generation that comes after that, they're just like us. Anyone who comes after, they are similar to us. So this is something that he would say, and then he would do his ijtihad from that point on. وَتَجِدُهُ يَسِيرُ فِي الْقِيَاسِ وَالْإِسْتِحْسَانِ. One of the two major highlights of the Hanafi usul is al-qiyas and something known as al-istihsan. Al-qiyas is when you use the ma'qul of the Quran. And we'll come to it, there's an entire chapter here, inshallah, that's going to be speaking about it in great depth, inshallah. Al-qiyas is using the ma'qul of the Quran. So it's using your intellect to come to the understanding as to what the Quran is actually telling you without it telling you directly. And also, that's one aspect of qiyas, because qiyas is so broad. And then you have something which is يُلْحَقْ النَّذِيرُ بِنَذِيرِهِ, which means that you look into something, and when you find something which is appropriately interlinked, okay, and if they have something which is something common between the two, like a specific illah or legal reasoning, you base a ruling, you base the same exact hukum based on the relative legal reasoning of two different issues that are similar in its legal reasoning. He used to do that a lot, alayhi rahmatullah. And also he would use something known as al-istihsan. So al-istihsan is quite similar to maslaha, which was something which is promoted by Imam Malik, especially more so, in which al-istihsan is what is the objectives of the sharia in the first place. And we'll come more into that inshallah. So can you use an objective of the sharia as a rule or as an evidence in of itself? Ultimately, if we can say that the objective of the sharia is for there to be preservation of wealth, for example, then so long as I get to that end goal, the means is justified, so long as the means isn't haram. And we'll come to that another time, inshallah. Because at that point, there's a difference of opinion as to whether or not that's permissible, depending on the usuliyin. So the usul scholars, they have a difference of opinion. Then you have Imam Malik alayhi rahmatullah. Imamatu madrasati ahl al-hadith. The Imam of the madrasa and the school of the people of hadith. As opposed to Imam Abu Hanifa, who was the Imam of the people of who? People of fiqh in Kufa. Imam Malik at that time was the Imam of the madrasa or the school of the people of hadith in Medina and Ard al-Hijaz. As for Imam Malik, one of the highlights especially of his usul, was promoting especially his ihtijaj bi'amali ahl al-Madinah, giving great consideration to the actions of the people of Medina. And this is something that he would not be apologetic over at all. He, alayhi rahmatullah, would be absolutely ready to reject an authentic hadith if it contradicted an action of the people of Medina. Now many of you would be really surprised to think, how is it possible that Imam Malik, one of the greatest muhaddithin that ever lived, would it ever be possible that Imam Malik would reject an authentic hadith by virtue of there being an action that was predominant in Medina, and he would say the people of Medina are doing this, and the hadith says that I give preference to the action of the people of Medina? Well, it depends. You need to understand exactly what that means. He's saying to you, and his argument is, and I'll give you an example, his argument is that the people of Medina, they are all, most of them during his time were the students of the companions. Many of them reached the companions. And he's saying if all of them are doing a certain action, they can't be wrong. If they're all doing it, it can't be wrong because they took it from the companions. And I'm not going to prefer a hadith which could be misunderstood. In usul, this means dhanni ad-dalala. Dhanni ad-dalala means that it's speculative in what information it's giving you. But when you see something which is happening practically, something which is theoretical, which is the hadith which is theoretical at this point in time, something which is practical, the students of the companions are doing this in front of my very eyes. I'm not going to take something which is theoretical over that which is practical. This is what it means when we say Amal Ahli Medina. And this is something which Imam Malik championed, alayhi rahmatullah. And there was an incident, I'll give you one mas'ala in fiqh, in which this usuli issue shows you why Imam had an actual impact in his fiqh. There's a hadith that's also collected by al-Bukhari, but even before that, before Imam Bukhari even collected it in his hadith, it was collected by Imam Malik in his book al-Muwatta. The hadith is an authentic hadith. Imam Malik acknowledges himself that it's an authentic hadith. He said, the hadith mentions, and it says, al-bayy'ani bil-khiyari ma lam yaftariqa. Famous hadith. Prophet he said, when two people are doing business with each other, there's a buyer and there's a seller, both of them have the option to opt out of that deal, so long as they don't part ways. Once they part ways, the deal is what? Solidified. It's materialized. Meaning you part ways, you leave the shop. If you come back and you say, oh, I want to cancel the transaction, the person who sold you the item has the option to say, oh yeah, I don't feel like giving it back to you. He can say that, legally speaking, and that's binding. Whereas if the person's still in the shop, according to the hadith by the way, if he's still in the shop, he can say he doesn't have that right. He has to give the money back. So this hadith was very problematic for Imam Malik, even though it's an authentic hadith, because he says the people in Medina, they don't do this. The transaction is materialized as soon as the money, as soon as the exchange takes place, as soon as the person takes the money, as soon as the item is given. From what I see in Medina, there is solidified, it's materialized, there can't be no returning back. So he says, I'm not going to take this hadith, and I'm not going to prefer it over the action of the people of Medina. Very interesting. And that's his madhab. That's an example of an usuli principle that has taken effect in fiqh. So if you want to see the relationship between usul al-fiqh and fiqh, that's it right there. This is an usuli issue and is a direct relationship with a hukum that is considered to be the mu'tamad or the official opinion of the madhab of Imam Malik. So that's one example right there. Who was the first person to author in this? Who was the first person to author a book in ilm al-usul, in usul al-fiqh? Because some people, sometimes the ignorance is very interesting, because you find some people who say that usul al-fiqh shouldn't even be studied. Did that happen in the time of the Prophet? There's so many things shouldn't be studied then. Tafsir shouldn't be studied. Knowledge of hadith shouldn't be studied. None of these should be studied, because none of that happened also. Who was the first person to author in this science? Who was the first person to put pen to paper? Does anybody know? Anybody want to have a go? Yes.
Idris.
Which Idris? The son of Idris?
Idris alayhi salam.
No, what I'm talking about in usul al-fiqh.
Oh, no.
We're talking about the Prophet Idris, the first person, yes?
I don't.
Imam Shafi'i.
Very good, Jazakallah
Imam
khair.
Shafi'i, mashallah.
There's actually a difference of opinion as to who was the first person. That which is mainly accepted is that it was Imam Shafi'i. This is disputed though, where they say that the first person to write or to author in this science was Qadi Abu Yusuf, the student of Imam Abu Hanifa. And others they say Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani also authored in this book. Also authored a book on the science, but it's been lost. No one knows today where that book is. It doesn't exist. And many books and many manuscripts have been lost through time. So don't be surprised. It's really sad, because sometimes you'll be reading a book and the author's quoting a book and that book doesn't exist anymore. You don't find it. Sometimes they'll say it's mafqud, it's lost. It's lost. Many books have been lost. So this book by Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, supposedly, that was the first book that was written in usul al-fiqh, has been lost. But that which we do know, and that which is the most accepted opinion by most, is that Imam Shafi'i was the first person, to write in the science, and he wrote a book called al-Risala. So the book called al-Risala was the first book that he wrote, and it was a request that was made of him. It wasn't something that he himself initiated by himself. And very important to understand this point, especially because many of the scholars of the past didn't author books for the sake of authoring it just because they wanted to. They didn't write a book just because they felt like it. Either it was one of their teachers would ask them to do so, or their students would ask them to do so. That's usually how it was. In this, there was a request by one of the greatest scholars who lived at the time of Imam Shafi'i, called Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi. And he was the one who requested Imam Shafi'i to write the book called Al-Risala. Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi, alayhi rahmatullah, hafidhullah, one of the great scholars of al-Hadith. And it's quite interesting the reason why he asked Imam Shafi'i. Because he was from the madrasa of the people of Hadith. And he had a problem with the people of the madrasa of al-fiqh. So he said, Imam Shafi'i at that time, he was more junior in the sense that he still was very linked to his teacher Imam Malik and the madrasas of the people of Hadith. So he wrote this book called Al-Risala, alayhi rahmatullah. But then many years later on, he revised it completely. So if you want to buy it today, there's the publication of Dar al-Minhaj, and that's the best publication. But any publication that you do buy today, it's going to be the revised version of Imam Shafi'i himself. Not his old al-Risala, his new al-Risala. Because his old al-Risala was based on his previous ijtihad and his previous madhab. Anybody who studied the madhab of Imam Shafi'i, you know that he has old madhab, madhab al-qadim, and he has madhab al-jadid, the new madhab. Anything from the time in which he migrated to Egypt in the year 199, any opinion that he either said or wrote down, or a statement that was made, or a fatwa, or answer to any of his students, or anything that he wrote down, or on the mimbar, or whatever the case may be, constitutes the new madhab, madhab al-jadid, which is the mu'tamad and the official madhab of the Imam alayhi rahmatullah. So he was the first person to write it. At that point on, it became a science which was completely, at that point on, that was the first time it was documented. Thus, the generations that came after contributed and codified the science, and it became an applied science. Every single Muslim from every denomination and every madhab, from that point on, made it a curriculum in their studies to study as a separate science, separate from fiqh. Because previously, people would study fiqh, but they wouldn't study the usul. But then it became a separate science. So that's the first time in Islamic history where usul al-fiqh was completely separated from fiqh. And you can say the same thing, and it's quite similar for ilm al-hadith, knowledge of hadith. So knowledge of hadith has different components. You have knowledge of al-mustalah, terminologies of hadith. You have knowledge of al-rijal, the people. You have ilm al-isnad, you have knowledge of the chains. You have knowledge of al-akhbar, information. You have knowledge of al-siyar. You have knowledge of al-jarh wa ta'deel, and all of these different things. So all of these things were separated as time went by, because it became so heavily invested in that it became an independent science. So it kept on it kept on evolving, you could say. So there was an evolution in the sciences. So ilm al-usul became something which was completely separated from ilm al-fiqh at this point. What's the two main madhabs of in usul? Because we mentioned, and what we know is today, especially today, is that there are different madhabs in fiqh, but there's also different methodologies and manahij also in usul and fiqh. Very important for us to understand that. You have two which were ancient, and one which was a bit more modern than the rest. Still ancient, but a bit more modern. It came after, it evolved after separately. And it evolved because it took both of them and combined it. So first you have that which is known as usul al-Shafi'i, the tariqah of the Shafi'iyah, the path of the Shafi'iyah. And the reason why they call that is because the person who introduced this science was Imam al-Shafi'i. So that is attributed to him. But it doesn't mean that it's only for the people of the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i, because this specific tradition is also the tradition of the Hanabila. And it's also the tradition of the Malikiyah also. So it's called Tariqat al-Shafi'iyah. It also has another name, Tariqat al-Mutakallimin, the path and the method of the theologians. So this is also another name that it has. And there's a reason why it has that name. Because many of the scholars that contributed to the science, they took into great consideration anything which would help understand, anything which was an element or an instrument that would help understand exactly what usul is. So you needed some prerequisites, you could say, prerequisites in ilm al-usul. So for example, they would speak about the nature of the Arabic language. So they would incorporate many things in the Arabic language, ta'rifat. What does these words mean and the importance? Because if you're going to be studying usul al-fiqh, do you not need to know what the word, what does zakah mean? What does this word mean? What's the nature of al-amr? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He's ordering you to do something. So what is the nature of al-amr? If Allah tells you to do something, how do I know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling me to do it by obligation? Or how do I know it's either by obligation or is it by recommendation? What is it? Is Allah telling me I have to do this? Or is Allah recommending me that I should do this? Similar with the Prophet ﷺ. When he says something, am I supposed to do? Is this by obligation or is this by recommendation? How do we distinguish between the two? So implementing and introducing certain concepts, philosophical concepts of the language was something which is very important. So they added that into the science. Also, what's the nature of good and what's the nature of evil? Because the Sharia, when Allah tells you something, it can't be bad, right? How do we come to the true understanding of the nature? This is something that that was incorporated into this knowledge, as you will come to see. That's why they call them tariqatul mutakallimin. And also, they would speak a lot about at-taklif, accountability. Who's accountable? What's the nature of accountability? Are you accountable for something that you could not yet have done? Are non-Muslims accountable for not praying salah? But they're not even Muslim. Exactly, that's the point. So are they? These are topics of discussions that took place, and this is incorporated into the science. Also, the nature of the prophets, before they became prophets, or before they were commissioned with prophethood. What about that? Say, for example, you had a situation in which a prophet said something before they were commissioned with prophethood. Does it take the same ruling as if though they said it? Does it take the same ruling as if though they were to say that same thing after prophethood? Say, for example, the Prophet ﷺ said something when he was 35 years old. Say, for example, he said something when he was 35 years old. Is that the same as though he would have said something after prophethood was commissioned? This is all something which will be spoken about, inshallah. The main books, and I'm going to conclude, inshallah, because there's not much time. The main books that were written in this tradition, the tradition of the Shafi'iyah, okay, were four main books. One book called al-Mu'tamad. The person who wrote it was Abu al-Husayn Muhammad ibn Ali al-Basri al-Mu'tazili al-Shafi'i. He died in the year 463. He was a Mu'tazili in theology, he was a Shafi'i in his madhab. Then you have the book al-Burhan, written by the great Imam, the author of the book that we're going to be studying. The same author of the book that we're going to be studying also wrote this book. The book is called al-Burhan. It's written by Abu al-Husayn Muhammad. It was written, by Imam al-Haramayn, Abu al-Ma'ali, Abdul Malik ibn Abdullah al-Juwayni al-Shafi'i, al-Ash'ari. Also, then you have al-Mustasfa, Imam Abu al-Hujjah, Imam Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, alayhi rahmatullah, al-Shafi'i. He wrote a book called al-Mustasfa. And then you have, these were the three main books. And then Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi came after them, and he took from these books, and he took all of them, and he wrote his great book in usul al-fiqh, one of the greatest works in Islamic history in usul al-fiqh, known as al-Mahsul. And al-Mahsul, later on, other Imams, like al-Armawi came, al-Imam al-Baydawi came, they took that book, written by who? Al-Mahsul, written by Fakhruddin al-Razi, and Imam al-Baydawi, he wrote his book, Minhaj للأصول الفقه, or Minhaj al-Wusul, ila ilm al-Usul. So all of these books were written, and they were especially of this tradition. And then who came? The great Imam Sayfuddin al-Amidi, he wrote the great book, al-Shafi'i, he wrote the great book, al-Ihkamu fi usul al-Ahkam. And inshallah, I don't think we have much time, but inshallah next week what we will do is we will mention the other tariqah. So you have the other madhab. We just mentioned right now the madhab of the mutakallimin, the Shafi'iyah. Inshallah next week we'll mention the tariqah of the fuqaha, also known as the tariqatul ahnaf. So the ahnaf, they have their own set tradition, usul al-fiqh. And then you have another madhab which combines both. And inshallah we'll mention that. Next week we'll also mention inshallah the biography of both of the imams who authored this book. And then we'll go straight into the book inshallah.